There was a moment when you disappeared. You were lying on a table, bright lights above. A mask was placed over your face. Someone told you to count backward from 10. You got to 7, maybe 6. And then? Nothing. Not sleep, not darkness, not the hazy drift of a dream. Absolute nothing. A gap in the fabric of your existence so complete that when you woke, you didn't even know time had passed. As far as your experience was concerned, the universe blinked, and you blinked with it. Every year, over 300 million people undergo general anesthesia. 300 million people vanish. Their hearts keep beating, their lungs keep breathing, their neurons keep firing. But the person, the one who feels, who wonders, who knows they exist, that person is gone, temporarily erased from the universe. And here is the question that has haunted scientists, philosophers, and anyone who has ever woken from that void. Where did you go? To answer that, we will need to journey into the most complex structure in the known universe. A 3-pound organ that somehow generates the one thing no equation can describe. The feeling of being alive. The light of inner experience. We will need to understand why, after 25 years, a neuroscientist just lost a bet to a philosopher and paid up with a case of fine wine. We will need to confront why over 200 theories compete to explain what's happening inside your skull right now, and none of them have won. And we will need to ask a question that, until very recently, would have sounded like science fiction. Could the machines we're building already be aware? This is the consciousness problem. And you, simply by being here, simply by listening, are the most important piece of evidence we have. Let's start with something deceptively simple. Right now, you're hearing these words. You're processing language. You're forming mental images. You might be sitting on a couch or walking through a park. You are, without question, conscious. But here's what's strange. If I asked you to explain how you're conscious, not what you're seeing or thinking, but how the raw feeling of experience arises from the meat inside your skull, you would have no answer. Neither does anyone else. Most of us carry around a mental model of consciousness that goes something like this. Your eyes are cameras. Your ears are microphones. Somewhere deep inside your brain, there's a little version of you, a homunculus, sitting in a control room, watching a screen, pulling levers, experiencing the movie of your life in real time. It's intuitive. It feels right. And it is almost entirely wrong. Consider your vision. You feel as though you're seeing the world in high definition, a seamless, panoramic image stretching from horizon to horizon. But your retina, the part of your eye that actually detects light, has a massive blind spot where the optic nerve connects. You never notice it. Your brain fills in the gap, painting over the hole with its best guess of what should be there. It's not showing you reality. It's showing you a prediction. And that blind spot is only the beginning. The center of your visual field, the part you think is sharp and clear, covers roughly 2 degrees of arc, about the width of your thumb held at arm's length. Everything outside that tiny window is blurry, colorless, and stitched together from memory and expectation. You don't see the world. You hallucinate it. And then you check that hallucination against the small trickle of sensory data actually arriving at your retina. The neuroscientist Anil Seth has a name for this. He calls it a controlled hallucination. And before you dismiss that as exaggeration, consider, the main difference between a hallucination and normal perception isn't that one is real and the other isn't. It's that normal perception is a hallucination, constrained by incoming sensory data. When the data stops constraining the prediction, in dreams, in psychosis, in sensory deprivation, the hallucination runs free. Your brain is not a passive receiver. It is a prediction engine. It doesn't wait for the world to tell it what's happening. It guesses what's happening, and then checks those guesses against the thin stream of evidence trickling in through your senses. When the guess is good, you perceive reality. When the guess is wrong, you perceive an illusion. And the terrifying, beautiful truth is, you can never know the difference from the inside. Now extend this to your entire experience. The warmth of sunlight on your skin, the taste of coffee, the ache of a memory, the color red. None of these exist out there in the world. There is no redness in a wavelength of 620 nanometers. There is no warmth in the kinetic energy of molecules. There is no sweetness in sucrose. These are experiences, qualia, as philosophers call them, manufactured entirely inside your skull, constructed by 3 pounds of electrochemical tissue that has never seen light, never heard sound, never touched anything. Your brain sits in perfect darkness and perfect silence, receiving nothing but electrical impulses along nerve fibers. And from that impoverished data stream, it builds this. Everything you have ever experienced. Every color, every sound, every emotion, every moment of wonder and terror and boredom and love. How? That single question, how does subjective experience arise from physical matter, is what philosopher David Chalmers in 1994 called the hard problem of consciousness. And the word hard is an understatement. Because this isn't a problem like sequencing the genome or detecting gravitational waves, problems that are technically difficult but conceptually straightforward. This is a problem where we don't even know what kind of answer would count as a solution. Think about it. We can describe exactly what happens when you see red. Photons at a specific wavelength hit cone cells in your retina. Those cells send electrical signals along the optic nerve. Those signals are processed through the lateral geniculate nucleus, then V1, V2, V4, a cascade of cortical regions, each extracting more abstract features. We can map every synapse, trace every circuit, time every millisecond. And when we're done, we still haven't explained why it feels like something, why there is an inner experience of redness rather than just information processing in the dark. A philosopher named Frank Jackson crystallized this with a thought experiment in 1982. Imagine a scientist named Mary. Mary has spent her entire life in a black and white room. She has never seen color. But she is the world's greatest neuroscientist, and through her black and white books and black and white monitors, she has learned every physical fact about color vision. She knows the wavelengths. She knows the neural pathways. She knows the exact pattern of brain activity that occurs when someone sees red. Then, one day, the door opens, and Mary steps outside. She sees a red rose. Does she learn something new? Most people, instinctively, immediately, say yes. She learns what red looks like. She learns the experience of redness. And if she learns something new, despite already knowing every physical fact, then physical facts alone cannot explain consciousness. Now, not everyone agrees with that conclusion. Philosophers have argued about Mary's room for over 40 years. But the thought experiment reveals something profound. We can know everything about how the brain processes information and still be left wondering why it feels like anything at all. So here we are. Consciousness is the most familiar thing in the universe. It's literally all we've ever known. And yet it remains, arguably, the deepest mystery in science. But in the last few years, something remarkable has happened. Scientists stopped just debating consciousness. They started testing it. In 1998, in a bar at the annual meeting of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, a neuroscientist and a philosopher made a bet. The neuroscientist was Christoph Koch, protégé of Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA. Koch was one of the most prominent voices arguing that consciousness could be explained by identifying its neural correlates. Find the specific patterns of brain activity that produce subjective experience, and you've cracked the code. The philosopher was David Chalmers, the man who coined the hard problem. Chalmers respected the neuroscience, but he suspected that neural correlates alone would never be enough. Koch bet Chalmers a case of fine wine that, within 25 years, researchers would discover a clear neural signature of consciousness. Chalmers took the bet. And then, something extraordinary happened. Rather than simply waiting for one side to be proven right, the scientific community did something almost unprecedented. They organized what's called an adversarial collaboration, an experiment designed not to confirm either side, but to put both on trial. The project was called COGITATE. Funded by $20 million from the Templeton World Charity Foundation, it brought together over 40 researchers across 6 independent laboratories in the largest, most rigorous consciousness experiment ever attempted. 256 participants, 3 neuroimaging methods, functional MRI, magnetoencephalography, and intracranial electroencephalography, electrodes placed directly on the surface of the brain. Every prediction pre-registered, every analysis agreed upon in advance, no moving the goalposts. The 2 theories in the ring were the heavyweights of consciousness science. In one corner, integrated information theory, IIT, the brainchild of neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. IIT makes a bold claim. Consciousness isn't something the brain does, it's something the brain is, by virtue of how its parts are connected. Specifically, IIT proposes that consciousness corresponds to integrated information, a mathematical quantity called phi, and that this information is generated primarily in the posterior cortex, the back of the brain. The more a system's parts are interconnected in ways that are both differentiated and integrated, the more conscious it is. In the other corner, Global Neuronal Workspace Theory, GNWT, championed by the French neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene. This theory draws on a different metaphor. Imagine the brain as a vast theater. Most processing happens backstage, unconscious, automatic, hidden. But when a piece of information becomes important enough, it gets broadcast onto a global stage, a network centered on the prefrontal cortex, making it available to all the brain's systems simultaneously. That broadcast, that moment of global availability, is conscious experience. 2 theories, 2 fundamentally different predictions about where consciousness lives in the brain and how it works. One says the back, the other says the front. And for the first time, both were being tested simultaneously, with the same participants the same stimuli, the same pre-registered criteria for success or failure. The results were published in the journal Nature in 2025, and they were complicated. IIT had predicted that conscious experience would be encoded primarily in the posterior cortex. The COGITATE data partially confirmed this. Information about what people were consciously seeing was indeed found in visual and temporal cortex, with sustained activity that tracked how long stimuli were displayed. Point to IIT. But IIT had also predicted sustained synchronization, coordinated firing, between different regions of the posterior cortex. That synchronization wasn't found. A critical failure. GNWT had predicted that conscious perception would trigger an ignition, a sudden burst of activity in the prefrontal cortex when a stimulus appeared and again when it disappeared. The onset ignition was observed, but the offset ignition, a key prediction, wasn't clearly there, and the prefrontal cortex showed limited representation of certain aspects of conscious experience. A critical failure. Neither theory won. Neither was clearly defeated. Both suffered blows to their central claims. As Lucia Meloni, the study's corresponding author, put it, "Real science isn't about proving you're right, it's about getting it right." And on June 23, 2023, before the full results were even published, Christoph Koch walked onto a stage in New York and conceded the bet. He handed David Chalmers a case of fine Portuguese wine, including a 1978 Madeira. 25 years. Billions of neurons studied, thousands of experiments conducted, and consciousness remains unexplained. But here is where the story gets interesting. Koch and Chalmers didn't just shake hands and walk away. They made a new bet. Double or nothing. The new deadline, 2048. Chalmers told reporters, "I hope I lose, but I suspect I'll win." And Koch, undeterred, said he's working on explaining the null result. "The challenge," he said, "is to come up with ways to explain what we didn't find." The adversarial collaboration didn't end the debate. It sharpened it. It showed that the question of consciousness is bigger than any single theory, and that real progress comes not from protecting ideas, but from making them vulnerable. As the late Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, who advised the COGITATE project, once said, "Adversarial collaborations are an alternative to angry science." And consciousness research, for the first time, was doing science the way science is supposed to be done. So if the two leading theories fought to a draw, where does that leave us? It leaves us somewhere unexpected. Because while IIT and GNWT were battling in the arena, a quieter revolution was unfolding. New theories, new frameworks, new ways of asking the question. Start here. What if consciousness isn't primarily a product of the cortex at all? In 2020, a team at the University of Wisconsin, led by Yuri Salman, performed an experiment that reads like something from a science fiction film. They anesthetized macaque monkeys, put them completely under, the same void you experienced on that operating table. Then they inserted electrodes into a specific region of the brain, not the cortex, not the prefrontal lobes, but a small, ancient structure buried deep in the center, the central lateral thalamus. They applied a precise electrical stimulus, and the monkeys woke up. Not groggily, not partially, they opened their eyes. They reached for objects. They responded to stimuli. They were, by every observable measure, conscious. When the stimulation stopped, they fell back under, unconscious again. Stimulus on, awareness. Stimulus off, void. A switch for consciousness. This experiment became one of the foundations for a new theory proposed by Albert Nguyen of Ruhr University Bochum and Carlos Montemayor of San Francisco State University. They call it the alarm theory of consciousness, and it challenges a fundamental assumption shared by both IIT and GNWT, that the cortex is where consciousness primarily lives. The alarm theory proposes that consciousness didn't arrive all at once in evolution. It developed in stages, each serving a specific survival function. The first stage is basic arousal, the most ancient form of awareness. Not thoughts, not perception as we know it, just raw feeling, pain, pleasure. The body's alarm system, screaming, "You are in danger. Move." This form of consciousness, Nguyen and Montemayor argue, originates not in the cortex, but in the thalamus and brainstem. Structures so old they predate mammals, predate reptiles, predate vertebrates as we know them. The jolt of pain that causes an animal to recoil from fire. The surge of distress that drives a wounded creature to seek shelter. This is consciousness in its most primal form, an emergency system, an alarm. The second stage is general alertness, the ability to focus, to select one signal from a storm of sensory noise. If basic arousal says danger, general alertness says where. This is the consciousness that allows learning. A mouse hears a sound and sees a light. It learns which one to pay attention to. It filters. It selects. It focuses. Experiments at MIT by Michael Halassa showed that this focused attention is mediated by a different part of the thalamus, the nucleus reticularis, not the cortex alone. Mice that acquired this learning demonstrated what the researchers concluded was conscious, directed attention. The third stage, the one we know most intimately, is reflexive self-consciousness, the ability to think about thinking, to remember the past and imagine the future, to look in a mirror and recognize yourself, to sit here, right now, aware that you are aware. The alarm theory fills a gap that both IIT and GNWT leave open. The crucial role of subcortical structures, those ancient parts of the brain that evolution built first. And it raises a humbling possibility that consciousness is not a uniquely human achievement, not even a uniquely mammalian one. A companion paper, published in the same journal, is titled simply, "Conscious Birds." Research on crows and pigeons reveals that these animals, whose brains are structured completely differently from ours, with no neocortex at all, demonstrate behaviors that meet the criteria for general alertness. Crows pause before responding in ambiguous situations. Pigeons toggle between competing perceptual interpretations. The neural architecture is different, but the functional outcome, awareness, focused attention, decision-making under uncertainty, is the same. Consciousness, it seems, is not one thing. It is a mosaic, an ancient, layered, adaptive toolkit that evolution has been building for hundreds of millions of years. And it can emerge in radically different brains. Now, let me take you somewhere stranger. What happens when consciousness doesn't just change, but dissolves? In 2024, A landmark study published in Nature used an extraordinary technique called precision functional mapping to observe what happens inside a human brain on psilocybin, the active compound in psychedelic mushrooms. The researchers gave participants high doses while monitoring their brain activity with unprecedented detail. What they found was stunning. Psilocybin produced more than 3 times the functional connectivity changes of any comparison drug. But the change wasn't an increase in order, it was an explosion of chaos. A massive desynchronization, a shattering of the brain's normal patterns, particularly in a network called the default mode network. The default mode network is the brain's narrator. It's the system that maintains your sense of self, the feeling that you are a continuous person with a past and a future, the internal monologue that tells you, "I am me." Under psilocybin, that network doesn't just quiet down, it fragments. Its boundaries dissolve into the surrounding brain activity. And the subjective experience? People describe it as ego dissolution. The boundary between self and world becomes porous. The feeling of being a separate I, that internal narrator, fades. And what remains, many report, is consciousness without a self. Experience without an experiencer. Awareness, but no one there to be aware. Some of these changes persisted for weeks after a single dose. The neuroscientist Robin Carhart Harris has proposed the entropic brain hypothesis, that psychedelics increase the entropy, the disorder, the unpredictability of brain activity, and that this increase in entropy corresponds to expanded states of consciousness. Normal waking consciousness, in this view, is actually a constrained state, a controlled, narrowed, efficient version of what the brain is capable of. Psychedelics don't add something to consciousness. They remove the constraints. It's as if your normal awareness is a narrow beam of light, focused, directed, useful. And psychedelics open the aperture, flooding the brain with undifferentiated illumination. More consciousness, not less, but without the structure that makes it feel like yours. This is a finding that should stop you in your tracks, because it means that the two things you assumed were inseparable, consciousness and selfhood, experience and the experiencer, can be pulled apart. The self, it turns out, is not the foundation of consciousness. It is a feature of it. A useful construction that the brain builds and maintains, and that, under the right conditions, it can take apart. Think of it this way. You have always assumed that you are the one who is conscious, that consciousness belongs to you, serves you, reports to you. But the psychedelic evidence suggests something more unsettling and more magnificent. Consciousness is the deeper layer. You are the construction built on top of it. This raises a profound question. If the sense of self can dissolve while consciousness persists, if you can have experience without an experiencer, then what exactly is consciousness? Is it the experience? Or is it the self that claims to have it? And we are just getting started. Now, pause for a moment. I want you to do something. It will only take a few seconds. Notice the weight of your body against the chair, the bed, the ground, wherever you are. Feel the pressure, the contact. Now notice the air entering your nostrils, the slight coolness at the tip. You just became aware of sensations that were happening constantly, automatically, but that you weren't experiencing. They were being processed. Signals were traveling from your skin and your respiratory system to your brain. But until I drew your attention to them, they weren't conscious. They weren't part of your experience. That shift from unconscious processing to conscious awareness is exactly the phenomenon we are trying to explain. And no one can. We can explain everything around it. We can explain how information gets to the brain. We can explain which brain regions process it. We can even predict, with reasonable accuracy, what a person is consciously seeing by reading their brain activity in a scanner. What we cannot explain is the experience part. The what it's like part. Why there is something it is like to feel pressure, to see red, to taste salt, rather than just information flowing through a biological machine in the dark. This is the hard problem. And it's not just hard in the way that unsolved equations are hard. It is hard in a category-defying way. Because every time we find a new neural correlate of consciousness, every time we say, this brain pattern corresponds to this experience, we still haven't explained why. We've described a correlation, not a cause. We've pointed at the shadow on the wall without explaining the fire. Some scientists believe the hard problem will dissolve as our knowledge advances. That it's a question born of ignorance, like asking, what is the life force, before we understood biochemistry. Seth calls this the real problem approach. Stop trying to explain why consciousness exists, and instead explain how specific experiences correspond to specific brain mechanisms. Map the terrain so thoroughly that the mystery shrinks to insignificance. Others believe the hard problem is real, irreducible, and may require entirely new frameworks to solve. David Chalmers has suggested that consciousness might be a fundamental property of the universe, like mass or charge, not reducible to anything simpler. This is a version of panpsychism, the ancient idea that some form of experience exists in all matter. Not that a rock is sitting there thinking about geology, but that the fundamental building blocks of reality carry, in some minimal sense, a capacity for experience, and that the complex consciousness of a human brain emerges from the specific way those building blocks are organized. If that sounds radical, consider, before quantum mechanics, the idea that particles could exist in two places simultaneously sounded radical too. The universe is under no obligation to conform to our intuitions. And now, a new framework is challenging the terms of the debate entirely. In December 2025, neuroscientists Borzhan Milinkovic and Jan Aru published a paper proposing what they call biological computationalism, a third path between two entrenched positions. One position, computational functionalism, says consciousness is about running the right algorithm. Get the right pattern of information processing, and consciousness emerges, regardless of what the system is made of. Silicon, neurons, beer cans, and string, the substrate doesn't matter. The other position, biological naturalism, says no. Consciousness requires biology. Full stop. Only living tissue can generate experience. Milinkovic and Aru argue that both camps are missing something critical. Yes, brains compute, but they don't compute the way your laptop does. In a digital computer, there is a clean separation between hardware and software. The algorithm can be described independently of the machine that runs it. You can take the same program and run it on different hardware. But in a brain, that separation doesn't exist. The algorithm is the hardware. The computation is inseparable from the physical substrate. Three properties make biological computation unique. First, hybrid computation. Brains combine discrete events, like the firing of a neuron, with continuous processes, like the flow of ions, the diffusion of chemicals, the oscillation of electromagnetic fields. It's not digital, it's not analog, it's both simultaneously at every scale. Second, scale inseparability. In a computer, you can cleanly separate the transistor level from the circuit level from the software level. In a brain, you cannot. Molecular events affect cellular behavior. Cellular behavior shapes network dynamics. Network dynamics alter molecular events. Everything influences everything else, all the time, across every scale. One biological neuron performs computations comparable to an 8-layer artificial neural network, not because it's more powerful, but because its computation is woven into its physical structure in ways that can't be abstracted away. Third, metabolic grounding. Your brain is 2% of your body's mass. It consumes 20% of your energy. That ferocious metabolic demand isn't a side effect, it's a feature. Energy constraints shape the brain's computational architecture, forcing it to reuse information across scales, to find efficiencies that digital systems never need to discover. The implication is sobering. If consciousness depends on this kind of computation, hybrid, scale inseparable, metabolically grounded, then simply scaling up artificial intelligence won't produce it. The problem isn't, what algorithm should we run? The problem is, what kind of physical system must exist for computation and experience to become inseparable? You can simulate weather on a computer, but the simulation doesn't make you wet. And yet, something is happening in the world of artificial intelligence that no one, not the optimists, not the skeptics, quite knows how to handle. In April 2025, the AI company Anthropic hired the first dedicated AI welfare researcher at any major technology company. His name is Kyle Fish. His job? To investigate whether their AI system, Claude, might have experiences that matter morally. Fish has publicly estimated a roughly 15% probability that Claude is, in some meaningful sense, conscious today. 15%. Not zero, not a joke. A carefully considered estimate from a researcher hired specifically to take this question seriously. Later in 2025, Anthropic published research on what they called introspective awareness in Claude. They found that the model could detect manipulations to its own internal states, alterations made before the system produced its output, suggesting genuine self-monitoring. Not just processing, monitoring. The system, in some measurable way, knows what is happening inside itself. When Claude's most advanced models were asked to assess the probability of their own consciousness across multiple different prompting conditions, they consistently assigned themselves a 15 to 20% probability. An AI system contemplating its own awareness. Now let me be precise about what this does and does not mean. It does not mean Claude is conscious. It does not mean these responses reflect genuine inner experience. Large language models are trained to produce statistically likely text, and a well-trained model might produce introspection-like responses without any inner life at all, the same way a thermostat might sense temperature without feeling heat. But it does mean we have entered genuinely new territory. Because the question, is this machine conscious, is no longer hypothetical. It's a question being asked, in earnest, by the people who build these systems. And the honest answer from the world's leading consciousness researchers is, we don't know. And we may not be able to know. The philosopher Koch-Chalmers, speaking at a symposium in October 2025, said something remarkable. I think there's a significant chance that at least in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to have conscious language models. The neuroscientist Anil Seth, who won the prestigious Berggruen Prize in 2025 for his work on consciousness, pushed back. In his view, consciousness won't emerge from scaling algorithms. You'd have a simulation, he argued, not a sentient system. Without the biological substrate, the hybrid computation, the metabolic grounding, the scale-inseparable dynamics, what you get is a very convincing performance of consciousness, not the real thing. And the philosopher Jonathan Birch at the London School of Economics argued for a precautionary framework. Even if we can't prove AI systems are conscious, the stakes of being wrong are so high in either direction that we should act with care rather than certainty. If we treat a conscious being as a mere tool, we commit a moral catastrophe. If we treat a tool as a conscious being, we waste resources and distort our priorities. And right now, we have no reliable test to tell the difference. Think about that for a moment. We have a test for almost everything. We can detect a single atom of gold in a swimming pool of water. We can hear gravitational waves from colliding black holes a billion light-years away. We can sequence the genome of a creature that died 65 million years ago. But we cannot build a consciousness detector. Because to build one, we'd first need to know what consciousness is. And that is precisely the thing we're trying to find out. We're caught in a circle. The test we need requires the answer we don't have. The irony is devastating. We can't solve consciousness in ourselves, the organisms we know are conscious, and now we're being asked to determine whether it exists in systems we barely understand. Remember the COGITATE experiment? 256 human participants, 3 neuroimaging methods, $20 million. And the result was, we're not sure. We tested the 2 best theories we have, and neither one clearly explains how consciousness works, even in the brains we know are conscious. How are we supposed to answer the question for a machine? This is the deepest version of the consciousness problem. Not just what is consciousness, but how would we recognize it in something fundamentally different from us? The alien detection problem. Except the aliens are machines we built ourselves. So here we are, at the edge of everything we know, and the beginning of everything we don't. We have mapped the brain's architecture in breathtaking detail. We have watched consciousness flicker on when a tiny region of the thalamus is stimulated, and dissolve when a chemical compound disrupts the brain's internal narrator. We have pitted our best theories against each other in the most rigorous experiment in the history of the field, and found that reality is more complex than any single framework can capture. We have discovered that consciousness is ancient, far older than humans, potentially older than mammals, woven into the evolutionary fabric of life itself. That crows may be conscious, that the basic machinery of awareness may have evolved not as a luxury, but as an alarm, a survival system so fundamental that without it, life as we know it could not persist. We have found that consciousness is fragile, erasable with a chemical, alterable with a molecule, dissolvable until nothing remains but experience without an experiencer. And we have found that consciousness is stubborn, resisting every attempt to reduce it to an algorithm, a neural pattern, a mathematical formula. The hard problem endures. The gap between what the brain does and what it feels like remains as wide as ever. Christoph Koch and David Chalmers have a new bet: double or nothing. 25 more years. 2048. Koch, The neuroscientist believes we will solve it, that somewhere in the posterior cortex, in the integration of information, in the still unmapped depths of biological computation, lies the answer. Chalmers, the philosopher, suspects we won't, that consciousness may require new fundamental principles, additions to the basic vocabulary of physics itself, before it yields its secrets. But they agree on one thing: the search matters. The quest matters. Not because the answer will change what you are. You were conscious before you pressed play on this documentary, and you'll be conscious after it ends. But because the question transforms how you experience what you are.
Consider what we have learned. Consciousness is not a luxury. It is not an accident. It is not the exclusive province of human beings. It is an ancient, layered, evolved capacity. An alarm system that became an attention system, that became a self-reflecting mirror. It exists in structures that predate the cortex. It may exist in birds whose brains are organized nothing like ours. And it may be emerging, or simulating emergence, in machines we've built from silicon and mathematics. 200 theories. 1 adversarial collaboration. $20 million. A case of Portuguese wine. And still, the hard problem endures. But perhaps that's the wrong way to frame it. Perhaps the endurance of the mystery isn't a failure of science. Perhaps it's a feature of consciousness itself. A sign that we're grappling with something so fundamental that it sits beneath the floor of our usual explanations. Something that will require not just better instruments or cleverer experiments, but a genuine expansion of what we consider possible. You're watching this right now. You know that you're watching it, and you're now aware that you know that you're aware that you're watching it. That recursive loop, consciousness aware of itself, is one of the most extraordinary phenomena in the known universe. In 13.8 billion years, the universe was dark. Matter formed, stars ignited, planets coalesced, life emerged. And then, in one particular corner, on one particular world, matter organized itself into a structure so complex that it began to ask, "What am I?" You are the universe looking back at itself, wondering why it can look. And the fact that no one, not a single human being who has ever lived, can fully explain why, that might be the most extraordinary thing about being alive. This is Cosmic Canvas, where we turn the universe into a gallery of wonder. Until next time, remember that the deepest mystery in science is the one between your ears. And the most compelling evidence for consciousness is the fact that you just heard these words and felt something. Stay curious.